also we're giving away a jacket, so yeah, if you're up the back, it's hard to win a forefront jacket.
Okay, we'll get started.
Ready to go?
Yeah. Well, I guess thanks for joining us, everyone. This is Security 307. This is the Advanced Concepts component of Forefront Identity Manager. A little bit like this morning's session, in the introductory session, we'll be covering off on a lot of demo content. So we want to try and pass on as much knowledge as we can over to you, so you can kind of kickstart your project, at least have the confidence to go into a proof of concept at work, configure the virtual machines and have a play with the management policy rules, etc. Can I have a quick show of hands who was in the session this morning? Oh, wonderful. So, I've got a pretty good strike rate on the return. Okay, so what we covered off this morning, for those who, in fact, let me introduce myself first. I'm Chris Luludakis. I'm a solution specialist from Microsoft for Identity and Access Management, covering both Australia and New Zealand. And I have with me Paul Conroy, who's the technology specialist for Identity and Access Management for Australia and New Zealand as well. We delivered a session earlier today, which is the introductory session. And we talked about the meta-directory concept. So what is a meta-directory? This database, this specialist database, which allows us to synchronize data from one application to another. We looked at a provisioning action. So we filled in a form with some information about a person, and we watched that information flow from the FIM server out to Active Directory. We looked at some common user self-service scenarios. So we looked at self-service password reset, where a user was able to answer or register some responses to some questions that only they know. And then if they forget their password, they can submit the answers and reset their password without having to call the help desk. We had a look at a simple group management scenario where an administrator created a dynamic group and was able to automatically populate the members of that group. We looked at a white pages scenario where a user can do a search on a person, find the details about that person. They were also delegated the ability to update their own details. In this case, it was the office phone number and mobile phone number. We did that through a management policy rule. And then finally, we looked at the delegation of an approval for a workflow, where we made a change, submitted the change, but then sought the approval of that person's manager before submitting it out to Active Directory. In the session today, we're going to kind of build on some of that knowledge that we've already developed this morning. We're going to go a little bit deeper into the management policy rules and take it a step further. We'll have a look at the synchronization rules. In fact, we'll have a look at the architecture first, so that we kind of set a common ground. We'll then go into a little bit deeper, have a look at the synchronization rules. And we'll sync out to Active Directory again, have a look at how we're actually doing all the mapping. We'll have a look at the creation of a workflow of an existing, or adding to an existing workflow for provisioning out to Active Directory lightweight directory services. Then go out and extend the FIM schema. I know that schema management is one of the things that most administrators fear, so we'll try and take some of that fear away from you. It is a pretty normal thing to extend the schema. We'll create a custom search scope using an XPath expression. So this is kind of some of the more advanced concepts. And we'll also go in and modify the FIM GUI. So we'll put in some data validation so that we can ensure that users are entering data in the correct format when they're updating some of their own personal details. And finally, we'll have a look at some of the things that MCS is doing, Microsoft Consulting, around creating some custom workflows. So with that, I'll hand over to Paul, and he can tell us about the architecture.
Okay. Well, we won't spend too much time on this, but it's important to talk about the architecture because there have been some fundamental changes to the earlier version of the solution, which is Identity Lifecycle Manager 2007. So at the top there we have solutions. If you look over to the right-hand side with the laser pointer, you've got things that you want to provide by an identity management solution. And we covered that fairly comprehensively in the morning session. You want to be able to manage credentials, smart cards, passwords, you want to be able to manage users, their groups, and you want to apply policies to that. So we already know that. We also know this second part with the FIM clients. Outlook is a way that people can do approvals. It looks like a meeting request. You can also do it through the FIM portal and also through the Windows logon page, through the Windows Gina. You're able to reset your password. So they're essentially the interfaces into identity management. This is the important part, the FIM platform. So as we saw in the other section, and we'll recap again this afternoon, we have an authentication workflow, we have authorization workflows, and essentially we have action workflows, which, if you notice the passage of the data as it comes from the request processor, happens after information flows into the DB, the database essentially. So authentications and actions will actually stop something from being happening. If you haven't been authenticated, we haven't got the correct authorization, that action or that process is not going to take place. However, with the action workflow, that process is going to take place. Then someone will get an email notification or something will be changed, some attribute will be changed. Can anyone spot a fundamental difference between ILM 2007 and FIM 2010 on this architecture slide? No one? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's here with the two databases. With earlier versions of Microsoft's identity management solution, there was always a metaverse. There was always a meta directory, which here is represented with the synchronization database. So there was always a way that you could connect different data stores, your IBM DB2 database, your Oracle database, your SAP system. There was always a method for you to do that, and that is essentially with the synchronization service. What is new is that you have a portal connected to a separate instance of SQL that can be run on the same box, but it is essentially a separate database. So there's plenty of documentation about scaling and scoping this, which we will not go into in this session, but essentially you can run it all on the same box, and that's what we have here for the demonstration. You can choose to run the synchronization service on a separate box. You can choose to run the FIM service database on a separate box, and you can choose to run the portal on a separate box yet again. Obviously, if you're running a large enterprise and you want to scale and you want redundancy and you want separation of tasks, that's going to be appropriate. But just so you know, you can separate those into specific architectures, and that's where deployment partners are invaluable, in that they can share their experience about the best scenario for an organisation of your size. Final thing, or second penultimate thing, is the FIM Certificate Management Portal. That's what CM stands for. So if you are managing certificates or smart cards through FIM, then that component is available. It has been available since ILM 2007. It is still available through FIM 2010. The only substantive change is previously you could only manage certificates from the Microsoft Certificate Authority. Make sense? That's still out of the box, but there is now an exposed API, so if you're using an Entrust, VeriSign, or some other certificate authority, you can use that API to make calls. So there is integration work required, but there is an extensibility point there. Now finally, you have your connected systems, and that's with the management agents, which I talked about in the morning session, and I'll briefly touch on again today. These are essentially your different connected data stores where you can take information from and push it to. Chris.
Okay, thanks Paul. Okay, so let's talk about sync rules. So in the previous session we talked about management policy rules. That's a collection of workflows. Authentication for things like password management, authorization for things like approvals, and then finally action workflows, which go out and do something. In the example that we had showed was a provisioning action, so we went out and synchronized some data out with Active Directory. What we didn't show is how that happened. So I want to kind of talk about a scenario just to set some context, and we're going to have a look at how an organisation wants to publish some information out into AD, and they want to have some data about the person, things like display name for example, published in a specific format. So we're going to go through and configure a sync rule that allows us to perform that action. Okay. So I'm logged into the Stockholm server, I'm logged in as admin, and this is the user interface, the portal-based UI that comes with FIM 2010. I have a link here for management policy rules, and when I click on that, it'll show me a whole list of management policy rules that either come by default out of the box or have been customized by ourselves, by the administrators. So I have an MPR here called the AD user MPR. So this is the one that obviously goes out and synchronizes with Active Directory. And it tells us that it applies to all people. It allows all people to create a resource, to modify a resource, remove attributes, etc. More importantly, on the policy workflows page, it tells us that it's associated with an action workflow, and that action workflow is
ADLDS.
At the moment.
You probably want to click the AD user
workflow is what it should be associated with. So when I click on that one, it tells me that it has a sync rule associated with it as well. And that synchronization rule is called, anybody want to take a guess? The AD user sync rule. Very creative. I mean, look, you know, with these things you can call them anything. Probably you want to create a standard naming convention so that it's easily identifiable as well. So I'll go ahead and click that, click OK on that because I did make a change. And I need to go into the administration page now and find that synchronization rule. So I've got a link there for synchronization rules. And I have half a dozen sync rules here already defined. The AD user sync rule is the one that we want to look at in a little bit more detail. So again, it's wizard driven as you go through one page to another. It's most of it is just simple, click, point and click stuff. On this page, it tells us that the sync rule can be inbound, outbound, or both inbound and outbound. What that means is it's always relative to the meta directory or to the sync service. So inbound is from the application into the sync service, outbound is from the sync service out to the application. So this is kind of the way that you can control that flow. So we have both inbound and outbound. We can define what the object types that it refers to. So in this case, it's a sync rule for just people. I could create another sync rule for groups. I can define relationships. So, for example, if I find account name in the metaverse and SAM account name in Active Directory and they're the same, and the values are the same, I can assume that it's the same person. So I don't need to create another account. It's just the same person, so I can build a relationship, then I can just synchronize the data. The really cool stuff happens here in the attribute flow. So I can now map the attributes from one application to another. So I can say, well, look, department in the metaverse will flow out to department in Active Directory. So when I make a change, the data will flow out. Notice as well that I can start to do things like, have first name plus a space plus last name maps to display name. If you're provisioning Exchange mailboxes, this is the place to do it as well. So I can define, the default mailbox or default mail database. I can maybe set some of the default parameters for that Exchange mailbox as well. So, mailbox defaults equals true, all that sort of thing. If, for example, that you were deploying OCS and you need to go out and update the user with their, SIP attributes and all that sort of stuff, this is the place that you could start to do that. What I'd really like to do is show you something kind of, using this visual UI, the declarative provisioning tool within FIM 2010. I want to show you how you can start to exploit it so you can get the best value out of it. So I am going to delete this one. No, not that one. I'm going to delete the display name. So here I'm just taking first name, last name, joining them together and making display name. I want to do something a little bit fancier, so I'll delete that one. And I will also skip to the next page, and I will delete that one. And I'll start again. So I'm going to create a new attribute flow, and the attribute flow is actually going to call, rather than just passing the parameters or the attributes across, I'm going to use a function. And that function is called proper case, and the attribute I want to apply the proper case function to is first name, Then I want to add a string, and that string is going to be a space plus another function. And again, I'm going to apply the proper case function, this time to display name.
Last name.
Sorry, thank you, last name. My brain's not working.
Post-lunch session.
That's right, and the destination will be display name. So does anybody want to take a guess as to what that's going to do? Yeah, thank you. It's going to capitalise. So the first character of first name and the first character of last name will be capitalised. So, you know, I'm now controlling the format. So it doesn't matter how it might appear in SAP or wherever you're sourcing it from. When I publish it out, I'm going to capitalise it. It's going to look nice. Okay. So there it is. And that's what it looks like now. Notice I didn't have to write any code. I'm the sales guy. You know, I can do this stuff just by using the inbuilt function. So it's nice and easy. I'm going to create another one. This time, I'm going to use a function again. And the function is going to be left. I'm going to take the first 3 characters. Use the constant value. Use 3. So I'm going to use the first 3 characters of your first name. Plus, I'm going to use another function. And this one will be random number. And we'll start at 10,000. And we'll end at 99,999.
Can anyone hazard a guess why we started at 10,000? Yeah, so it's 5 digits long. So if we started at 1 to 9,999, you could potentially have 1 digit, but it's going to start at a greater number.
For the jacket.
For the jacket?
For the jacket. Do you think we should give away the jacket?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. For the jacket.
Pick a jacket up at the end of the session.
What are we going to map this to? What's the attribute that we should map this to? What is it? What's the AD attribute that we should map it to? Nope.
He deleted it just before. It's almost password, but not quite. Yeah.
Unicode password.
The answer is Unicode password.
There it is there. So now effectively what I've done is I've taken the first 3 characters of your first name, plus I've generated a 5-character random number, and that becomes your password. I can incorporate that into a notification and send it out to the person's manager the first time that, or when this person first arrives, you know, the manager will get an email saying, you know, when your new starter arrives, please, you know, walk them through the login process. Here's their password. I can also make it a little bit more sophisticated, so I can set the reset password attribute to 0. So the first time they log in, it'll force them to reset their password. So, and you can do that on initial flow only. So only when we're creating the user and not beyond that. So there's an example of how you can start to manipulate the sync rule and get some real value out of the provisioning process. I'll take 2 questions. We'll do 2 questions at the end of every section, and then if we have time, we'll take some more afterwards. So I've got a question here in the front. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, does it have its own random password generator? So you can do that through a custom workflow. Paul's going to talk about the custom workflows later. In fact, MCS has developed one. So the APIs are there, it's just not in that. But yes, you can do it, where you can create a password, not only using random numbers, but random characters. Yeah, so absolutely you can do that through a custom workflow, yeah. That was just a simple example without having to write code. So that's, I guess, what I wanted to show, that you can use these functions to do all these, you know, various outcomes. Have another question back here. Does somebody want to ask one? No? I'll take this one. Mm-hmm. So the question is, workflows can be unidirectional or bidirectional. Yeah, so where you say, can we capture collisions, can you describe a little bit about what you're... Right. Okay. Right, so in this case, what we can do is we can define, so the question is, can we define essentially, if I can paraphrase, an authoritative source for data? So when somebody makes an update, what happens, who owns the data? So we can actually set what we call a precedence, and therefore honour, a particular change. Or we can also define filters which control the data flow in one direction only. So, if somebody tries to update AD with employee number, they might be allowed to do that, but we will never flow it back, and certainly not back into SAP, because we can define the rule that blocks it from ever happening. So, yes, absolutely, we can do that. I am conscious of the time, so we can take some of the other questions a bit later on.
Jumbo, finish with this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've gone through a recap of the synchronization rules and how they relate to management policy rules, which will then be related to workflows, which are then related to synchronization rules. What I'll take you through now is workflows for provisioning. In the morning session, we saw provisioning to Active Directory. That was very nice, and that was pre-can. You'll see exactly that when you download, or if you choose to download the demos for this session. What I will show you now is something that we have customized. Quite often customers ask us for ways to provision users into extranets. So essentially all their internal users are within Active Directory, they're managed, IT administrators have a very good grasp of what's going on within there. But they have an extra requirement for additional users, maybe their partners, maybe their customers, and maybe they only want them to have access to certain external facing portals. They do not want to have those users within Active Directory. So one way that we present to solve this solution is by using a lightweight directory, AD-LDS, or ADAM in the old documentation. So you can put that into an extranet. You can put an ADAM or AD-LDS directory in another external, maybe a DMZ, maybe an extranet part of your infrastructure, and you allowed your external facing web service to authenticate to that. You can use FIM to provision users out to this AD-LDS directory to allow that to happen. And that's what we're going to show in this instance. Switch over to the demonstration. Cancel out of that. So what we'll do is go back to workflows, and I'll show you that we in fact have an AD-LDS workflow, which, as Chris showed, calls upon a synchronization rule called AD-LDS outbound. We go to synchronization rules, and we can see that we have manually created a synchronization outbound rule which contains the minimum requirements for provisioning a user to AD-LDS. You can see that we've created the first name, last name requirements to be captured and filled into the objects within AD-LDS. It also has first name, employee type, and employee ID, which will be filtered through to this external facing directory. So to recap what we have to do, we have created a synchronization rule, which will be called by a workflow, and we have an NPR, which will call that particular workflow. So you can see the cascading logic there. I'll then click on the workflow, and the NPR, which will call the workflow, and the workflow in this instance to be called is from the add user NPR. Anytime we create a resource or modify a resource, these particular workflows will be called. So it's at this point we can say only goes to AD, or we can say goes to AD-LDS. And it's at this point we can define certain attributes to be flowed through. So maybe all contractors go to AD-LDS, or people with the partner attribute populated will go through to AD-LDS, or maybe they go through to AD, however you want to set it up. So at this point, the logic is defined to allow certain users to go through to AD or your other connected data store. In this particular instance, we will connect on both, so users will be flowed both to AD and LDS. ADLDS. So, we've defined the MPR, we've defined the workflow, we've defined the synchronization rule. So what we have to do now is we have to call the run profile from which the management agent is allowed to flow through the data to the ADLDS store. So as you can see, we have the HRMA, the Active Directory management agent, and we've created an ADLDS management agent from which the synchronization rule is attached. There are run profiles which have been created for this particular management agent, and as you can see, there's an export, a full import and sync, as well as a sync only. So the first time that we run this management agent, we want to do a full import and sync. So that will import the schema from ADLDS. We're running this in the background at the moment. And that will allow the synchronization to take place. So any attributes which are in the metaverse, which have previously been taken from AD, will be taken through. So we've done that. And we want to do an export. Oops, still running. Can't run two run profiles at the same time. Okay, configure run profile, run. So we'll now export to the connected data store, allowing that to run. And then we'll go to ADLDS and see the new users provisioned into the Lightweight directory. Running a little slower than the morning session. Ooh, that's not good. We haven't had any adds to that. So we'll see if there's a change been made to the Lightweight directory. So we'll go to the other server, which we'll do a refresh on. So we haven't had any adds to it. So what I think I've done here, so I'll go back to the Stockholm server and I will run a synchronization loop. I believe we haven't exported any new data into the FIM data store. We've got to take the data out of AD, provision it into the meta directory. So we've taken the data out of HR, we've taken it out of FIM, and we've completely synchronized that. Now I'll run this again. I'll do a full import and sync. Definitely running more slowly.
Yeah, getting a failed connection.
Ah, right. Okay, we're
So
getting
there was a question in the recharge bar. Derek asked, can we do a trace? And that's the console screen that you would use to do a trace, and you can determine, you know, from a problem-solving perspective, what's been going on. If we saw some additional users added, you could go in and click on the hyperlink. It'll say, you know, 6 people added. You can find out what their common name is, what their grid is, and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, well this is interesting, but not in a good way. So this is trying to connect to the Sydney server, which is the ADLDS server, and it sees the server is actually down. We're looking at it, and we can see that the Sydney server is in fact up and it's operational, but for some reason we're not able to get a connection to it. So yeah, I guess there's something wrong with the network on the virtual machines. But it's simple to demonstrate or to talk about what would be demonstrated. We just have new users populated into here from AD. So the same users that are in AD would be populated into the Lightweight directory. But yeah, it looks like there's a network configuration issue with that particular server. All right, with that,
Okay.
move on to Chris.
So let's talk about extending the schema. I think, you know, kind of said this before, but it's extending the schema is the thing that kind of puts fear into most administrators. The reality is, from an identity management point of view, we always need to extend the schema because there's custom attributes that your applications require, and we need to be able to populate those into the meta directory, the metaverse, so that we can accurately represent what those applications require. Now, by default, FIM implements the Active Directory schema and also the INET org person schema, which is the industry standard for people. But as I said, inevitably your applications might require some specific thing, and therefore, you know, we will need to extend the schema to cater for it. So in the scenario that I want to talk about, We've got this line of business application, and it requires a new attribute to be created. But I guess we also want to be able to allow the users, maybe, or the administrator to go in and update it. So really there's two tasks here. One, I need to create the attribute in FIM. And the second thing is I need to be able to go out and modify the FIM UI to allow users to modify it. So there's really two tasks that are necessary. In this example, Woodgrove Bank, well actually, look, they're a very progressive company. And they've sent all of their IT staff to TechEd because they want them to learn. So what we're going to do for Woodgrove Bank is we're going to extend a schema with an attribute called TechEd NZ, and we'll modify the FIM UI to allow users to update it as well. So let's have a look at that.
Just to emphasise a question that was asked in the morning session. So in the morning we were talking about extending the AD schema. What we're doing now is extending the FIM schema only. So essentially that separate database, the FIM service database, not the AD schema.
Right. So then I can use the sync rule to map the new attribute that I create in FIM with an existing attribute in AD or a new attribute. You can make that choice. So the way that I do that is I go into the administration screen, and the first thing that I'll do is I'll go into schema management, and I'll click on all attributes and new, and I'll create a unique attribute called TechEd NZ, and I'll call it, the display name will be TechEd NZ. They don't have to be the same, but it does make it easy. I can choose what sort of an attribute it is. So I'll say index string. I could provide a description, but I won't do that. I'll do that a little bit later on when we do the validation. We don't need to do any localization. So next, next, and submit. So now I've created the attribute within FIM. What I need to do is to bind it to an object type. So I'll click on all bindings, click on new, find the object type that I want to synchronize it or to extend. I'll extend it with the user attribute. The attribute that I want to bind, I'll do a search there, is TechEd NZ. And I can simply go next, next, next on all of these pages, submit it, and I'm done. Okay. So now I've created the attribute. Now I need to expose it in the FIM UI. So back into administration, into resource control display configurations. Now what I
was just going to say RCDC, the resource control display configuration, is a long-winded way of describing the FIM GUI. So anything that you see in the documentation talking about RCDC is essentially the GUI, which Chris is modifying now.
Okay, so every one of the pages that we've been kind of navigating through are controlled by one of these, objects here in the RCDC configuration. So if I scroll over to the next screen, there is a page for user editing. So if I go ahead and click that, what I can do is I can export. It's an XML document that controls all of the configuration, so I need to go ahead and do an export. And I can save it to my desktop. And I'll just call it TechEd New Zealand. Save that. And now I need to edit it with Visual Studio.
You can edit it in Visual Studio or any XML editor of your choice.
Make sure you don't do it in, WordPad or something like that. You need to make sure, because it is an XML document, you have to make sure that the document is well formed. So what I will do is I will cheat, and I will take a copy of an existing section for first name or an existing attribute, and after display name I will paste that stuff in, and simply I need to replace first name with TechEd NZ now. How did I do that? I think it was like that, wasn't it? And there's, I think, 5 entries that I need to replace. And the last one is there. So I can go ahead and save that now.
As you see, Chris has saved this configuration as configuration TechEd New Zealand. Keep the old and original configuration, because if you have made do not have a well-formed document, then you're going to have trouble reverting back to the old one.
Okay, so what I've done is I've gone to configuration data. What I can do is I can browse now, find the file, open that, apply it, submit the change. Now, because I am making a change to the user interface, I need to do an IIS reset. So let's do that. Stop it. Restarts the web server. Let's go back into the portal. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to search on a user and see if it actually actioned that change. When you first log into the portal or first fire it up after a reset, it does take a few seconds to cache. So there's a little bit of dead time here. Okay, so if I go back into the users section, do a search on any user. Chriselle will do. Okay, so we can see first name, last name, middle name, display name, and now TechEd NZ has appeared. But I'm logged in as admin, and I can't modify that. Any ideas why? Sorry, yeah, exactly. So even though I'm an administrator, I've still got to go through and I've got to delegate the permission to a person, an administrator or whoever, that they're allowed to modify that. Okay, so the first thing that I need to do, go back into administration, go into filter permissions, and I can define here what the administrator is allowed to do, or the administrator types, and what the non-administrators are allowed to do. So I'm an admin now. I may as well just go in as the admin. Go into the permitted filter attributes. In allowed attributes, go out and find TechEd. Yep, that's the one. So I'll click OK there. So now that attribute has been added to the filter. That's all cool. Submit that. Need to make one more change, and this is in the management policy rule. So go back into the MPRs, and for admins, there's an MPR called administrators can read and update users. So I need to modify that one as well. Now obviously if we wanted users to do the same task, we'd need to find the user MPR or the contractor MPR or the full-time employee MPR or whatever your MPRs are defined as. So let's go through and allow admins to do the same function. In requesters and operations, we can see what they're allowed to perform in this particular MPR. And the target resource, click on the little book again, find the TechEd attribute, click on that. So it's now saved to the list. Click OK, submit it. Let's do an IIS reset again. Go back into the FIM portal, and we should see that that attribute is now editable.
When you install FIM for the first time, there are a whole bunch of management policy rules, workflows, and sets. Sets are essentially the groups which workflows call upon, which are created by default. So the ones that Chris has modified in this particular example already exist. Obviously, regular users and administrators. If you wanted to have different administrations, such as contractors have a different view, as opposed to full-time employees, that's the configuration work you'd have to do independently.
Okay, so we can now see that the attribute is editable. I did have to write a little bit of code, you know, so you do have to become familiar with XML, especially for the RCDC. And obviously, if you want to create custom workflows, you might need to create some code there as well. But generally, I mean, I'm a sales guy, right? I can get in and do it. Sure, it's rehearsed, but you know, after you become familiar with it, it's fairly easy to go out and do. I can click OK on that, submit it, and I'm done.
Okay, so we've managed to extend the FIM schema, make sure that we're clear that that's not the AD schema, but you can map across those FIM attributes to a regular attribute within AD or a schema modification which you've done as a separate piece of work. What we'll now talk about is some set definition and modifications through XPath. So I'll show you what XPath configuration can do within search scopes within the FIM GUI, and I'll also show you how you can use the declarative wizard to define sets, and also how you can go a little bit beyond that. So we'll go back to the administrative console, and up here in the top right hand corner, you might have noticed through our earlier parts of the presentation, we've got search scopes here. So we're able to define all users, all contractors, all full-time employees, and that is essentially defined through XPath. So I'll go to the administration console and we will play with the search scopes. So there's one which is called golfers, which I want to modify. So this is a search scope, and we'll do some modification through that to see some of the XPath which we'll use later on. So if you want to define your own search scope, you'll all obviously add it up here, all sales, and we'll call this all finance people. Description. All right, through the keyword usage, this is where the search scope is going to be available. Global means that front home page. Through the later parts of the portal, for example, the person part of the portal, which is under all users, that is something that has to be defined if you want to have a user defined. With all these particular keywords, every part of the FIM RCDC will be exposed to this particular search scope. Order, we'll define it so it's right and obvious down the bottom, so we'll put it a number of thousand in order of precedence. Search definition, and this is where we define the XPath. Display name, that's what's going to be shown as far as the attribute which is searched, and here we define the actual object which is searched, and here we will search for the union of all salespeople, so all members of the group's all sales, and all members of the group Woodgrove golfers. We'll change that to all finance, and we'll make it not the intersection, but we'll make it the union of those two sets. So a great way that you can test if your search scope or your set definition is on target is simply click outside the frame and it'll actually show you the set. So that looks about right to me. If I changed it to the intersection of those sets, check that. Okay, so there's no one who's a member of the finance team and sales team. That kind of makes sense. So we'll leave it as or. Click outside. That search scope looks well formed to me. Results, localization. The results page is the redirecting URL where it was shown. That will be under all people. And we're good to go. We've defined a search scope. As with any RCDC modification, we have to do an IIS reset. Shut that down. Starting up the web server again. And we'll go back to the portal and see if that new search scope is available to us. Maximize the page. So up in the top right hand corner we should have a search filter which is looking for all sales and finance people. And there we can see all precedence 1,000, so it's down the bottom. If it was 1, it would be right up the top. So right down we have an ability to search for all sales and finance people. So they're either in either of those groups. So we'll search for a person such as Chris L. We'll search for it, and it'll go to the location. So Chris L.
Just Chris.
So is it just Chris?
Well, I don't like golf, so maybe I'm not in that group.
So we'll look for user Mark. Sorry, what was that? Okay, so Mark. So we've looked for all users. There we go. So there's a user who's a member of the all sales or all finance team, and that's Brian Perry. And we can search for a person who's part of all users, who's not part of that, which is Mark. So you're able to tie down your searches to a limited subset of not just all users, all sets, all workflows. So what can we do with this XPath? Through the definition of a set. So from here, sets are fundamental because all workflows are based on sets, and as we saw previously, all MPRs are based on workflows. So to define a new set, we will define one using the wizard, which we will then go and play with the XPath associated with it. So we'll call this all users who are not Chris. We'll have no description here, so we'll find a very small set of, or a very large set of users who are not Chris. So from here we can use the declarative wizard, and we can look at the user objects that match all of these statements. And so from here we can look at display name and is or is not. Okay, so is not. We're having problems with Chris before, so I won't use it. I'll stick with Brian. So we'll have a look at Brian. So display name is not Brian. And right from here we're able to look whether that set seems both well-formed and accurate to us. There's Brian Perry.
We'll have to do display name is not Brian Perry.
Brian Perry. So on the fly, we're able to do changes to the membership, and there we can see he's gone. So we can see if our actual filter is correct, well-formed, and accurate. So right there, we've created display name is not Brian Perry. Looks good to me. We have an option of manually adding people to that particular set, but in this case, we will choose not to. And we're finished. So we've used the very easy declarative wizard to create a set. So we'll search for that set and do some manual modifications to it now that we've used the wizard. All right, we're about to go to it. We go back to the set that we've created manually, and in the bottom right-hand corner, we're able to switch to the advanced view. So if we go to the advanced view and then look at extended attributes, it's here we have exposed to us the XPath associated with set creation. So as you can see right here, identical XPath to what was done with the search scopes. So you're able to define your XPath within the search scopes, see if it's well formed and accurate, and then you're able to cut and paste it into the set definitions. So right here, I have a set which is a group of people who are not Brian Perry, and we can just make some modifications to make that a group of people who in fact are Brian Perry. So I submit that. If it is not well formed, it will be give me an error at that stage. Click on that, and we can see it's changed. So from there, we've modified the XPath to define a set. So you can either do it declaratively using the wizard, or you can use XPath to have more granular control over definitions. One thing that I want to make absolutely crystal clear is there is a slight difference between search scope definition and XPath definition, and that is when you define sets through XPath, you can only go through one level of deference. So you're able to define all members of a group, you're able to define people who are or are not a certain display name, but then to take a second level of deference, such as all people who are not Chris, and let's get a list of their managers, that can't be done because that takes a second level of deference. So as long as it's only one level of deference, you're able to have a lot of granularity when defining your sets through XPath. With that, I'll hand back to Chris.
Do you want to take a question?
Yes, we'll take two quick questions before we head on. Yeah. Yes, good question. So the question is, we've made lots of changes. What auditing and reporting is exposed through that? So to answer your question, there is not auditing and reporting out of the box, but there is a web services interface which is exposed where you pull the rich auditing and reporting data out of there. Every change that's been made, every approval that's been made is recorded, but you have to use the web services interface to pull it out. There's no pre-canned wizard to show you those reports. Yeah, so the question was, is that stored in an unalterable state? So the answer is it's stored in logging format. And it's intended to be unalterable, but it's not like a diode or a one-way storage device. So you'd have to make your own arrangements to have the data pulled from the web services interface, put into a one-way storage device. So that's not available out of the box. We'll leave it there and take any extra questions at the recharge bar afterwards.
Okay. So we're in the home stretch now. Let's talk about FimGUI modification. So the scenario that I want to describe is, earlier today we showed how we wanted to delegate the ability for Sonny Bill to be able to modify his profile and add his own phone number. What we didn't do is provide a description for how that phone number should appear, and what we didn't do is put some data validation around the structure, so the semantics around how that phone number should appear. So let's go and have a look at how we can achieve that. So let me just quickly skip out of here and go back into the Cairo machine. Who we logged in as Paul. Paul will do. Doesn't have to be Sunnyville, it can be any user. And I do want to fire up IE. I got it as a favourite. There we go. So I just want to be able to demonstrate that, we can do a search and we can only see the phone number. And then I'll go into the administrative UI and change that.
Another thing we mentioned before, and it'll be clearer now, as you can see, the NPRs, the sets, and the workflows are not exposed to a regular user. Before we just said users obviously have a different display to administrators. Now, as you've seen what we've done, that makes a little more sense. There's a separate NPR which exposes certain attributes or certain attributes to end users, and there's a separate NPR to administrators as well. So that's the actual workings behind the different display.
Okay, so we can see the office phone number, and Paul is allowed to edit it. I won't edit it. I'll just click OK or cancel and go back to the server as admin. And I want to go into administration and schema management again. Now, I do have an attribute called TechEdNZ and phone number and all that sort of stuff, but really, so what I could do is I could modify the description at that level, but then what that would mean is wherever that attribute, like the office phone number, is bound to another object, user, group, etc., it would be modifying that as well. Really all I want to do is I want to modify the binding, because that gives me greater granularity. So it's just the binding for the user object. So let's do a search for Office. So I want to find the attribute called Office Phone which is bound to the user. Click on that. And the attribute override here, I want to put a description, and that description is please enter your phone number using the format in the following example. And the example is +64, which is your country code, an area code, and then 7 digits. Is that correct? Okay. So how do we get the user to enter it in that format specifically? Well, this is where we're going to use a regular expression, and we're going to use the validation page to enter what that regular expression looks like.
It's a 19-character regular expression, and Chris doesn't know regular expressions that well, so I'm curious whether he gets it.
Now,
I was going to make fun of
down.
him, but my ADLDS server didn't get up and running, so I'm not. Not
Do I win it? If I get this right, do I win a jacket?
We've run out of jackets.
Okay.
So let's see.
Okay, so what I need to do is I need to start the regular expression. Who's familiar with regular expressions? Okay, so, it's kind of like a language of its own, and you can do a search out on the internet, using Bing, of course, and you can find the structure for it. And this is the way that we start it. So we start with a caret, we enter the bits that we want within the brackets, and I want to start it with +64.
So he wants to validate it, so it's exactly the same
That's
as what he
exactly
wrote
this
down.
format. So +64, a space. Then I want a digit, and just the one digit. Then I want another space. Then I want 3 digits. Then I want a dash. Then I want 4 digits.
It won't check if it's a 3 or a 4 in there.
What's
That's good
that?
enough. That's good enough.
That's good enough.
That's good enough.
Here's the tricky part. I need a pipe. If I don't put the pipe, it's going to say you have to put it in this format. So every time somebody goes into that page, it's going to force them to update their phone number. What I'd prefer is that users can either enter their phone number or they can leave it blank. So by doing that, if I have the pipe in there, it will allow them to leave it blank. I'll close it off, and then $1. I reckon I should get a prize if I get this right.
We're running out of time.
Submit it.
Let's go.
What else do I need to do? IS reset, because we're modifying the UI. Okay. Should be done. What's this one? Cairo. Okay. Shut that down. Start again. Launch the UI again, log in as Paul. Okay, my profile. Moment of truth.
Be interesting.
Contact info. Well, this seems to have worked, Paul.
That was the easy part.
Please enter your phone number using the following example. +64 space. Well, I can enter anything. It doesn't have to be a 4. Oh, a dash, and then that. I click OK. Tells me what the old value is, what the new value is. What old value was, what the new value is. Submit that. It didn't error.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's worked.
I win.
I think it's worked. Well done.
I get a jacket.
Yeah. Okay, well, definitely.
Not that hard.
So, good parts with that is that it's a really easy way. You don't have to play around with XML to put a description in there, which is nice, and you can have some validation in there as well to make sure that it's in the correct format. So, what we'll do to wrap up is look at the creation and reuse of custom workflows. So you saw through us creating workflows, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you get out of the box, but for many people that isn't enough. So what MCS and our deployment partners have done is use the .NET suite of languages to create custom activities, which they then export to a DLL, and through the FIM interface, you're able to import that particular DLL which contains the workflow. Here's some examples of ones which have been created. MCS has around about 15, but they're not the only people. Deployment partners have also created their own custom activities. We've got log requests to files. It's quite a commonly asked one. Validating attributes and activities. But these top two are definitely the most commonly required one. Chris showed you where you can create a 5-digit random number without using any .NET coding, but a lot of organisations that isn't enough. They require alphanumeric characters and extra stuff in creating a random password. So a custom activity has to be created for that. You have to do some custom coding or reuse what a deployment partner has already done. Also, generating a username activity is one which I'll show you a little bit more of. So, deployment. In this case, Microsoft Consulting has used C#, generated a DLL, imported that into FIM, and as you can see, there's a brand new workflow which is available called Generate Username. Through the wizard, if you click on that, you're able to define the length of the username, which is nice to meet your company's password or your username policy, and importantly, you're able to check against both the FIM database or Active Directory or both to see if that username is unique. If it's not unique, it will go through the process of generating a new username. And the example is this. The Microsoft consultant is a gentleman from Poland called Andrea. And so if Andrea was being entered into the system, the first choice would be the first letter of his first name, A, and then his last name, Budja. If that is already in the database, then it will go and use the first 2 letters of his first name. If that is not unique, it'll go to the first 3 letters, the first 4 letters, and it'll keep going through until it develops a unique username. That is not available out of the box, but you can create your own custom activity that does that kind of complicated workflow and meets your own requirements for creating unique usernames. If you don't want to do it yourself, use a deployment partner who's done it before and retains that IP. So in summary.
We're bang on time, so let's do a quick summary. We had a look at the synchronization rules, and we had a look at how we can modify the synchronization rule. We can use things like custom expressions and functions in there to be able to map the data from one database to another, or backwards and forwards through the FIM database. We had a look at a provisioning action and specifically provisioned or attempted to provision into the ADLDS directory, and we saw how we could take the existing management policy rule and extend that so that we could provision into 2 directories using the one rule. We extended the FIM schema, so we added a new attribute to an existing object type and showed how we can expose that through the FIM UI. We used the XPath query, so this was kind of one of the more advanced concepts where we could create a search scope using an XPath string. We modified the FIM GUI to allow a user to update their phone number using a specific structure, so we could control the data structure and the semantics of the entry. And then Paul talked about the custom workflows as well. I think we've really only scratched the surface. It's a really, really powerful product.